The next short commentary comes from the opposite side of the globe. Kevin Parnell is from the Australia and New Zealand scientific community, but works now in Estonia, and his experience is with science involving communities and decision makers in specifically coastal issues, but I think there's something for us to learn. Please.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure whether this presentation fits better in this session or the next one, because it sort of ranges across science to policy into implementation. So with that in mind, I hope I can say some useful things. The message I'm trying to give is relatively simple, and that is that the work of most scientists in some ways almost disqualifies us from becoming too much involved in the policy advising role. And because of that, it means that the academies of science and like organisations have a very important role in representing some of the work that most of us end up doing. I'm going to do that by giving you some examples of some cases where the work that we do leads us to be not independent, to violate a number of the principles that are set down in papers like this. This is the list that Peter Gluckman, the chief scientist of New Zealand, published in Nature a few years ago, indicating how to give advice to government. And it was mentioned by a previous speaker. It's a well-known list, and I'm sure all of us would have slight variations to it, but I think most of us would agree that these principles are valid and particularly useful. But that's not how most scientists work. Most scientists need to be salespeople. We need to be lobbyists. If all scientists work to Gluckman's principles, obtaining funding and implementing science-based projects would be next to impossible. Scientists want their work to be relevant, and they want their work to be translated into successful projects. Now, I understand the currency of publication in science, and I work within that, but nothing gives me as a scientist more pleasure than to see some work that I've been working on translated into a project that betters the environment and betters people's lives. We all know that money's scarce, and not all worthy projects will proceed. And I'm not talking about research funding here. I'm talking about the implementation of a project that is put up, whether it be at a local scale or at an international scale, that requires funding to go ahead. There'll be competition within and between fields. And I feel very sorry for politicians and policymakers having to decide not whether one project or another project with common ground go ahead, but whether one project, perhaps on an environmental issue, goes ahead against a project which may have social implications. And those are the decisions that we give to our policymakers, and they're not easy decisions. And I feel sorry for those people that have to make those decisions. But once you get into implementation, success often leads to further opportunities. And I think that is a goal of many scientists. So a typical project pathway might look something like this. We secure funding and support for our research, we undertake the research, and we publish it. And many extremely good scientists choose to leave the process at that point. But many choose to go on and try and get that work out there and into projects that are implemented. So we involve ourselves in communication. We involve ourselves in securing support for implementation, and then we work with the implementation team in having that project go ahead. So it's looking at this little diagram. I'm not talking here about securing money to undertake a research project. I'm talking here about once the research has been undertaken, we're ready to have that taken up, should the politicians choose to take it up. So between science and the political decision, which almost always will involve funding, therefore there is going to be competition, the politicians need to prioritise your suggestion, your project, your ideas against other competing projects. And even once the decision has been made to proceed, to get the project implemented, we have to at least assist in ensuring that the project is a good one and is going to succeed, because the political implications of a failed project can be very significant. For the individual, it's unlikely that you are going to get support for another project, but it can also has implication for the decision maker. So how do we do that as scientists? Well, sitting in between the science, the decision and the implementation, there is the community. Politicians worry about community. They are answerable to the electors, to the people out there that are voting for them. So while we as scientists may well be trying to influence the political decision makers, we also perhaps need to be involved in bringing the community on board, both before the decision has been made and after it's been made through to implementation. So I'm suggesting the scientist has a role in all of those green areas there. We are not just providing advice, we are there to assist by perhaps communicating with the electors in making life easy for the politician. So in saying that, much of the work of many, or I would even suggest most scientists, is political. It involves lobbying, and therefore it will violate some of Gluckman's principles. So as individuals, most of us almost disqualify ourselves from providing that sort of policy advice. So I've just posed the question there, which I hope I'll come back and answer at the end of my talk. Can these scientists, these people, the majority I would suggest, also be effective policy advisors? And I'm going to address that just by giving three very brief examples from a number of places around the world. And in so doing, I'm almost going to say that it makes life difficult for me to be a policy advisor. And the first example regards mangrove reforestation in Vietnam and Indonesia. This does have a European connection because almost all of the funding has actually come from European aid money. Now, we undertook some research there which showed very clearly that most of the projects have failed. And they've failed because of two reasons: poor nursery techniques and the use of an easily grown single species rather than a multitude of species. The solutions were fairly simple. But I couldn't go to the government, go to the senior administrators and say this project has failed because there could have been two consequences. One was that funding would be withdrawn, and that was the last thing I wanted. And the second, which is particularly important in Asia, is that the very well-meaning, very competent local people putting these projects into action would lose face. And that would probably mean the death of the whole project area. And that was not what I was wanting to do. So the conclusion of that was that we presented the information in our research as an integration of science and local knowledge, which was put forward by those involved in the project. So it was a development, not just simply you failed, you've got to do something else. So I'm not sure how clear these are. These are some mangrove propagules, basically all dead. This was what we were seeing, what we were experiencing, and we had a solution. The top was the failure, things dying, replicated, dying, use a different set of species, and the project aims were able to be completed. The second example comes from Northern Australia, between Australia and Papua New Guinea. And in this particular case, it relates to climate change and sea level rise. Research demonstrated that many island communities are currently threatened and will be more threatened into the future. We came up with some, I think, good medium-term solutions, but when you looked at the cost per individual, we were talking about something like 50,000 to 100,000 euros per inhabitant to actually implement these solutions. Now, deep down, I'm not sure that's worth it, but these are communities with very unusual cultural characteristics. They are important communities, I think, internationally for their cultures, and I really did want to help them. So the action from me as the scientist was that I had to become a community advocate. I lost independence. I was unable to then go to government and say, this is the policy, because I had given that right up by becoming a community advocate for something which economically probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, I make no apology for that. And we've been relatively successful. We've got something like 17 million euro for an island which has a population of about 300 people. It doesn't make economic sense. It might make cultural sense. So this is the area I'm talking about. It's between the northern tip of Australia and Papua New Guinea. There are a number of these little communities. This is one of them. It's a place called Boigu. It has a population of around 300 people. You know, the same as a suburban street in Tallinn is what we're talking about here. You can see some of the problems there, water going through the community right now. That's what the community looks like now. That's what the community looks like at highest astronomical tide right now. That's what the community will look like if we get a little bit of sea level rise and at a time where we get some storm surge as well. You can see the problem. Is it worth looking after these communities? Is the political question. My role is to advocate on behalf of the communities as a scientist with the data that I have available. And in this particular case, things are being built to remedy that problem, at least in the media term. The last example I want to give is also from Australia, but a very different cultural setting, and that is the Gold Coast, probably Australia's best known beach resort. The research that was done there supported some major interventions, but the politicians were very nervous. A lot of very influential people live on the Gold Coast. Politicians are very concerned about what people think. They are politicians after all. So the action required there was that we provided communications materials both before the project was approved and after the project was approved to foster community interest and support. We almost turned into the representatives of the politicians to ensure that the research that we had undertaken was actually implemented. We solicited and organised supporters. Again, that disqualified me from having a broader policy position. Now, the Gold Coast is a very expensive piece of coastal real estate, and there is a massive and very high-cost coastal management regime that goes on there. One project was just $9 million worth of beach renourishment, which we undertook just before I came to work in Estonia. It used novel techniques. It was very different to other beach renourishment projects that had been undertaken pretty much anywhere else in the world, and a major communication effort was required at all stages of the project. I'm just going to show you a few seconds of a video. I hope will play. This is the sort of communications material.
The Gold Coast is perfectly positioned as a destination for business investment.
Okay, they've got the wrong video.
The Gold Coast is a city coming of age.
Okay, can you pan that one?
Perfectly positioned as a
it's the wrong video. It's not the one that I asked for. The message in the video was basically selling the project to the community. But you know, we now have to think about communication, and how as a scientist do we get involved in communication? Well, in this case, putting it up on YouTube helped, but let's think about that. How do you reach wealthy beach property owning individuals and make sure they understand the project? Well, what we did was produce a little video card that we put in all the cafes. You know, people going out for their Sunday morning latte had these sitting on the table. When you open them up, the video that you actually do want them to see starts playing. So, you know, I think we just have to think a little bit outside the normal box when it comes to providing the support to those people that are making the decisions. We've now lost the, some concluding thoughts. We obviously need to work within political cycles, and perhaps I'll say more about that with the panel. We need to support political decision makers, which can be quite difficult at times, particularly if our political views don't necessarily match up with those of the politicians that we are supporting. And as scientists, most of us need to communicate, advocate and lobby. But this really highlights the very important role of the academies. The academies and other organisations like the academies allow people like me who have given up our right to be direct policy advisors through our colleagues in the academies, through the chief scientist officers, through other people like that. It gives us, again, the right to put our case to those bodies that can then turn that into policy and take it further up the line with respect to more general, not project-specific policies. And in many countries there are lots of avenues, but in places like Estonia, I've found, in smaller communities, there are fewer scientific advice organisations and individual science advice roles, which really, I think, makes the academies in smaller places, in smaller communities like Estonia, even more important. Thank you.